Thank you for the warm introduction. So before I start, one quick thing. As you can tell probably from my accent, I do live in Milan, but I'm a native English speaker from New York, which means I tend to speak very quickly. So if I get like 5-10 minutes into the presentation and you don't understand anything, just raise your hand and say so and tell me to slow down. That usually happens. It tends to go with being in front of large groups of people, getting nervous, getting excited, and it's more important we do this in a way that everyone can feel included. So as he mentioned, I'll do this quite quickly. I am from Design Group Italia. I'm here and I'm skipping our 50th anniversary event and party at the Triennale Design Museum in Milan. But today is actually the 50th anniversary of the founding of the studio. In terms of my own cross-cultural, multilingual capability, I speak English, Italiano, Francais. I don't speak any German despite having a German last name. I am a descendant of someone who left Austria in the 1880s and went to the United States, but I don't speak German. I only recently learned how to pronounce Blitzer the proper way from a German friend. So I definitely represent a certain cross-cultural background myself. I've also dabbled in learning in school Chinese and Hebrew, and I acquired Spanish comprehension by learning Italian. And I live in Milan, and I'm from New York. So I personally take quite a lot of pride and interest and fascination with cross-cultural and multilingual design and what that means. All of these languages I learned not because my parents do. My parents only speak English, and as a child in New York, I was quite embarrassed and felt really uncool because my parents only speak English. Because in New York, everyone is multilingual. My childhood best friend had a Japanese mother and a Puerto Rican father. So she spoke 3 languages at home and I spoke 1, or English with some Yiddish. So here I am, now I speak 3 languages, working on maybe 4 or 5. But my goal today is to talk not just about language, but a lot more about culture and what that means in the new global design challenges that we face. So before we start, I want to talk to you a little bit about one of the first projects I did in Italy where I really got into some of these challenges. So about 1.5 years ago, I did a project with a major Italian bank, I can't say which one, in which we did a lot of research understanding the relationship that people have with their bank as a physical place and the relationship that they will want to have with their bank as an online place, as online services, as traditional banks try to update. The reality is most of the young bank customers that are the bank customers of the future, that are likely to be high wealth individuals, that the bank would like to hook in now while they're 35 and under, they grew up somewhere in rural suburban Italy and they opened their first bank account here at the Italian post office. In the United States, the post office is not a bank. A lot of young Italians, they have a bank account only here. So when they go to the bank, they take a number and it looks like this. And this isn't necessarily the post office in a rural place. The post office in my hot designy neighborhood in Milan looks just like this. But when people go to the bank, this is sometimes what it means in Italy. And then eventually they move to a big city, they want to get a different kind of account, and they'll open up a bank account at an online bank or with a new hot bank or one that's been well reviewed. But to them, originally, this is what it meant to go to the bank. So sometimes these are things. For me, going to the bank was a very different thing. I grew up in the middle of Manhattan. Going to the bank sometimes meant going to my mother's office because she worked at one, which was not a branch. So every project you do, you unravel the stereotypes that you have yourself about the places. And this is a theme that we'll keep coming back to today. But before we do that, I want to talk to you all a little bit about the word culture, which is quite a loaded term. And there are many, many definitions out there. But of all the different ones I've seen around, my favorite is this one. This comes from a psychologist and researcher who's still writing numerous books, but in a book in 1996, he said, "Culture is the set of attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors shared by a group of people, but different for each individual, communicated from one generation to the next." So this is really, really interesting because we're entering markets and businesses where there may be common beliefs in a global international city. They may not be so common, but each individual has a different perspective and a different way that they experience this. Every person is a product of the different cultures that have influenced them. So our challenge as designers is to figure out how to unpack this and figure out how that affects what we design. At the very macro level, to what we design, what we propose, all the way down to what we put on the button that converts the sale, completes the task. So it has to start at the macro level and go all the way down to the micro. A lot of times when we talk about these kinds of projects, people tend to confuse culture with language. And it's really important that we separate them. Language is a part of culture, culture is a part of language, but they're not the same, and we have to consider both. So language, we talk about the method of human communication, how we communicate with each other, but also the system of communication that we create. This is really just the dictionary definition of language. But what's really important to say is that, and I'm sorry to the person who talked to me about this morning and said, I'm really excited for your talk to talk about localization, internationalization. Culture is not only that, it includes these things, but really understanding culture affects how we implement these things. So how do we make our products fit an international market? How do we localize our products to different markets? And how do we translate them? That's the manifestation of what we understand and know about culture. It's one part of it, but it's not the whole thing. And I could do a version of this talk where I talk all about, give you examples of a phrase that in English in a UI is 2 words and 10 characters, and in German in a UI is 3 words, or 1 super long word that's 40 characters, and in Chinese is 2 symbols, 2 character-based symbols. And we all know those struggles. If you've ever gone through a project where you have to translate it, and then you translate everything, and then the UI breaks to tell you not to use Google Translate, but that's not the talk I'm doing today. Those are all really important skills, and they're really necessary. But I wanted to talk about culture and how it affects the early stages of a project and user research and how you can understand different cultures. One other note I'll make is I work at this studio called Design Group Italia. Italia is in our name because originally the founders envisioned Design Group Austria, Design Group Japan, Design Group Iceland, Design Group United States, but we've kept the Design Group Italia name because in Italia it's quite well known. But this office is actually about half Italian, half not. I'm not even the only American. We have about 15 languages in the office. So we deal with these kinds of projects all the time, and they're sort of our bread and butter. Clients come to us quite often for these kinds of projects. But let's go back to talking about culture. So culture is kind of like this. This is an example of someone who I've worked with a little bit on this subject, who's a professor, used in a talk that we did together, which I've now reused, in which there's someone who kind of understands what it is. The fish says, how's the water? But the other fish in the water say, what's the water? Because they've always been there. Culture is something we always know. But sometimes as designers, we're challenged to design things that are not for our own culture, or we design it for our culture, and then unknowingly, the company takes it and reuses it in a different culture, in a different context, in a different setting. And so our goal as designers is to be as aware as we can of what that means and to do the best job we can of fitting into cultures that people have, while perhaps we're also changing culture. So next what I'll do is I'll introduce a couple different ways that people talk about this theme, both in research, in different models that people have created, and then I'll talk to you about a few different methods, tools, and tips that we can take to take these themes and apply them to how we actually do our work practically. So the first and foremost, this is one of the speakers, writers that I probably love more than almost any of the others. Bill Verplank is a design thinker and professor at Stanford who famously has led and challenged a lot of the ideas we have about empathy and understanding users. And he created this map, which I assume many of you have already seen, but if not, don't be shy, in which he says that part of interaction design and understanding the user, so more about the user and the person himself or herself than the world around them, is about answering these questions. So how do you do? So that's what the hand is for. What sorts of ways do you affect the world? Poke it, manipulate, sit on it. How do you feel? So how does the world make you think and react? And what sense of the world do you have? And then also, what do you know? How do you know? What are the ways that you learn and plan, or perhaps how do we want you to think? So this actually, the text comes directly from his lesson where he taught this originally in, I think, 2001. And we now can see, looking at it, how these different questions have shaped a lot of the modern concepts that we know in user experience, like mental models, different types of inputs and outputs. The professor I mentioned before wrote this excellent book on cross-cultural technology and design. She writes quite a few articles, named Watong Sun. She's at the University of Washington. And in this book, in the first chapter, she drives home this point where she says, a problem in cross-cultural design is there's a disconnect between action and meaning. So we have things that we see in interfaces that we interact with that have a meaning for us, and we assume that icons mean certain things, terms mean certain things, shapes mean certain things, colors and shadows mean certain things, but it's not the same for everyone. So she tells the story of back in the 1990s. Watong was a young student who arrived in the United States from China, and she got put in front of a computer for the first time. And there was this folder icon, and everyone seemed to understand what it was, but she had no idea. And the folder is, of course, we all know this metaphor now, in and out. We've known it for years. But she didn't understand because the folder icon is a derivative of manila folders that in American culture are quite ubiquitous. They're everywhere. Even in offices today where things are digital, they seem to be everywhere. Whereas Watong told the story that in China, this is how she carried documents around. So they look quite different. So in her head, the thing that holds documents is not that, but it's that. So as we move away from using language and we use icons as a fallback, sometimes we miss what the meaning is. And she goes on to develop and understand this concept. And she says that cross-cultural user experience is both situated activity and constructed meaning. So we construct meaning when we construct and design interfaces. And we have to think about where the activity takes place. And that's the biggest challenge that we have, is to try and understand what that is. What meanings have people constructed? How do they perceive things? So now I'm going to walk you through some of the widely accepted models that I've chosen to select and present, given the time that we have and the focus of the talk. There are a few well-known ones that I've not included by choice, so I assume someone may ask me about it later. But the first one, and one that we probably talk about the most in my office of these different models, is what's called high context and low context culture. This first was developed in a book by Edward T. Hall in 1976. He was a famous anthropologist. And he tried to understand what concepts of culture are and what things are foreign, what things are modern. It's also really interesting when you think about 1976, how they represented the concept on the book cover is quite different than it probably would be today. So he broke down a bunch of different areas in which cultures may differ, and then he synthesized this as what he called high context and low context. So one of them is this idea of direct versus indirect. This is probably the largest challenge I've had adapting to the work environment in Italy. In the United States, especially in New York, I could send an email to any client that's like one sentence and never offend anyone. In Italy, if I were to do that, the client might actually call my boss or the person how he or she reached our company and say, why was Julie so rude? Why didn't she ask me how my weekend was? Why didn't she remind us of everything else that's going on? She just sent me this one email saying, oh, the meeting's on Tuesday at 10 a.m., don't forget. You know, in New York, I could send that email and nobody would ever be offended. They'd be pleased that I reminded them, and we'd move on. What this also means is how you relate to people, how you ask for things, but also how users and people from these cultures expect and perceive directions are quite different. So if you see interfaces that are designed and start in Italy, sometimes the directions and the instructions are quite different as well. The next one is quite obvious, and this is another that when we talk about culture but also affects our understanding of models of government, is are we considered as individuals, or are we worried about the collective needs of our society? And cultures will have different perspectives on this issue. Then going back to direct and indirect, direct and indirect can also be broken down thinking about tasks and relationships. So this is another example of how this might be. The task focused is, okay, here's the task that we want to get done. The relationship is, I'm going to talk all about the relationship, and then I'll mention the task in the middle. So the way that Edward T. Hall broke this down is he actually went further and he said, okay, the world is divided into low context cultures and high context cultures. And low context cultures are like where I come from, so they're quite direct. They're task-based. And high context cultures are where I live now. And if you think about where you're from, where you live, maybe it's slightly different on this map. Maybe you fit into a different place and a different culture. The studio where I work, we have an interesting challenge because we have the 3 partners who guide the strategy and vision of the company have all spent a long time living in Italy, but only one is Italian and the other 2 are Icelandic and English. So we have 3 different mindsets that sort of drive and guide our work on a daily basis. Another way that this can be broken down is by using what's called the context square. So thinking about where cultures are on high context or low context culture. And then yet again, going back to these different dimensions and variables that Edward T. Hall broke down and rephrasing them. High context cultures tend to use group-oriented values and spiral logic. So when I first arrived in Milan, I was a student in Master of Interaction Design. I had this wildly famous interaction design professor. He's sort of regarded as like a godlike figure. And we used to have these critiques with him, and he would be drawing on A3 and take all these notes, and then he would hand us the paper, and we had no idea what anything was. We followed him while he was talking about it. We felt like we learned something, but we couldn't tell you what it was. And that really was about the second point, about spiral logic versus linear logic. And actually, the lectures that would happen in our international school would often reflect this dynamic, that those of us from these low context cultures would feel kind of lost being thrown into the high context environment. And then the last one is also really, really interesting. So for me, I personally, if you all leave and you don't understand what I tell you, I think it's my fault. I think I can do the talk better. In some other cultures, it might actually be the other way around. It's that I said what I say, I know what I'm going to say. You all, it's on you to understand. And so this also changes the relationship that we have with the interfaces. So here's another theory. This is probably the most widely discussed one. I personally reached out to Watong, the example I gave before with the folders. I reached out to her because I read an article she wrote in which she talked about why this theory is not good. But I would be remiss not to mention it because it's the most famous one, the most often cited. So this is a study that was released in 1980 but was conducted in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And Hofstede broke down the cultural dimensions in 5. And they're quite interesting, but they're limited because of where the source is from. So he talked about power distance, uncertainty avoidance, group orientation, which is one that's in common with the other, masculinity and femininity, and long-term versus short-term orientation. But the real challenge is Hofstede was doing the study in IBM in the late 1960s and early 1970s with people from different countries. That was his entire sample. So this is considered like the most widely regarded cultural model that we have, but it was based on people who were programming in IBM and talking about programming of the mind. Now, I would never say that programmers are not wildly brilliant. They're wonderful to work with. I am the child of an engineer. I totally am also programmed a little bit in this way. I learned to code on my own, but they're not a representative sample of the greater world. And so this model is quite interesting, but it's limited to the sample that he had. Then one more that I think is most interesting and relevant to our work, which is a little bit out there, but not as many people know about this one, is a book that was published in the 1990s called The Clock of the Long Now. Stuart Brand is famous for having been the editor of this bizarre publication called The Whole Earth Catalog. And he presented this model called pace layering. And this is an image from his book directly. And I'm going to read the quote because he describes it better than I ever could, in which he says, "This is a cross-section of a healthy civilization where the layers represent parts of society that move at different rates. The most rapidly changing parts are at the top, such as fashion, and the slower parts are at the bottom, such as culture. Turbulence occurs when lower layers move faster than upper layers." So we can all think about examples of what this turbulence means and how it confuses people. So, for example, in Italy, one of the most common forms of turbulence is fashion and some other pieces go really far ahead, but the governance and the infrastructure goes almost backward or does not move. And that's a common challenge that occurs. And then sometimes they push really far forward in confusing ways. But this is thinking about how fast things change and where we are and where the projects that we're doing fit on these different levels. What kind of change are we trying to affect? And how and why? Do we want to affect change by introducing new kinds of behaviors and devices or not? So one other story and example I'll give is I recently, maybe 6 months ago, I went to visit my older brother in Texas. I have a 4-year-old nephew, so at the time he was 3.5. And my brother did the great American Texas thing in which he built a new gigantic 300 square meter house with a white picket fence and a yard, but it's a smart house. There's a speaker system wired, there's microphones everywhere, so you can actually talk to Alexa anywhere you want in the house. My brother's like the ultimate gadget hound. He's always had the latest computer, the iPhone the day it comes out, and I have always had his old stuff, and as long as it works and I can play with the code, do whatever I want to do, I've been happy. But the manifestation of this is my 3.5-year-old nephew at the time understands Alexa and has all these interesting, weird mental models about the digitalized world. So he kept saying, Aunt Julie, can you ask Alexa this? Can you ask Alexa that? Because his voice, he couldn't say Alexa, he would say Alessa, and she wouldn't respond. But he thinks of Alexa as this like omnipresent human in the house. And then a few hours later, we're playing like a role-playing game, and he's like, okay, we're gonna go shopping. And I like assumed, I was like, well, are we gonna go to the mall? Because they live really close to this big famous shopping mall. And he said, no. And he picked up like a piece of paper, and he was like, this is mommy's iPad. And he proceeds to go like this. and I go, okay, what are you buying? And he's like, okay, I'm getting new shoes for school. And then he like pretends that he's picked out the shoes. And then he goes, okay, now it's time to get the shoes. And I was just like watching him amazed at what was going on. And then we go, also because in Italy, e-commerce is still sort of entering the market very slowly, and Amazon is driving that. And then we go to the door of the house, and he opens the door to the house, and he's like, the postman arrived. Or no, maybe he said the UPS guy. And then we closed the door, he pretended to take a box, and we walked back and sat on the couch, and he's like, okay, now I'm opening the box. And so that's his idea of going shopping, because they order everything online in the house. My brother and sister-in-law work quite a lot, and that's his mental model. So where that fits into this and how we think about it is quite different. And when you enter different cultures, this is also really relevant because people have different models. So what e-commerce means in Italy is quite different when we think about relationships as a way of doing service than what e-commerce might mean in the United States, what it might mean in Scandinavia, what it might mean here. But what we need to do is think about where all this understanding of culture that I've tried to share with you, what I've been understanding and what we've been trying to understand at Design Group Italia, is how do I practically think about what we're designing? Because on a daily basis, we can define it in all different ways. A lot of people here will say product design. The people in my office who do physical models and prototypes will all want to kill you, but products, services, brands, and touch points. But the reality is, in our office, we're not designing those things. What we're really designing are relationships. We design the relationships that humans and people have with all of the things that we design. And we design the relationships they build with these devices, with these interfaces, with these brands, with these applications. And so our responsibility is quite heavy because that means we're also designing culture. So we're designing how culture and behavior is changing because we have at our fingertips technology that is changing so much. And is influencing so much about culture and in some ways globalizing different things, but then also localizing other parts. So my challenge to you is I will give these practical methods and tips, but I want to embody and share and help you all embody this mindset to be respectful of the different cultures and find different ways to understand them. And these models and tools are ways that we can break it down and think about different ways that we can compare and understand them as we try to understand them. So next up, I'll go through these methods, and then at the end, we'll have some time for questions. Some of these will probably seem like old news, others will be new. My number one most important tip, and this is something we've probably all heard, is to get out of the building. This is how Jeff Gotthoff refers to it in his Lean UX book. We can't understand the culture that happens outside if we're sitting in our office. Even in my very multicultural office, there's some people there who believe we can understand because we have people from 15 countries. But the reality is, some of the things about the post office and the bank, I would not have understood if I had been just talking to the Italian people in the office. They had a different experience, a very specific sampling of different places in the country, and you really need to get out and do your research. And what this means is on every single project, especially if you have challenges of entering new markets, internalization and localization, you have to go to the place. Whenever possible, you have to go to the place. Find the budget, find the way. If you don't have the budget to fly there, do remote meetings, do whatever you can, have them send you pictures, like whatever it takes. And the people will usually be, why do you need us to send you a photo of like the street corner? But just do it. Like you just convince them and they do it and they're confused, and that's how you begin to understand how people are working or what you're designing might fit into their daily life. Another piece, which I think is, this I never would have put in this presentation had I been working on this subject before moving to Italy. But now having experienced quite a few things as a non-native speaker, I think this is relevant. And due to the global mobility and migration of immigrants, refugees, students like myself as I entered Europe in this way, it's really important to think about non-native speakers. They have a different understanding and perception of language and cultural meaning than the locals. And if they intend to stay in the place that you're trying to enter this market, they are your market. They're just as much your market as anyone else. And whether or not right now, today, they may not be able to afford your products, all of them, they are your market. So one story I have is, at one point, I worked in an ad technology company called AppNexus, which maybe you heard about because they got acquired by AT&T earlier this year. And we were designing a tool that helped people run ad campaigns. And we had this tool that we talked about global. So we said you can run your ad campaign globally. So basically, you would set up this like automated ad campaign that would then try and buy stuff on automated auctions. That's how much of display advertising works on the internet. It's this whole like big mechanism and sort of auction-style stock exchange that happens behind the scenes. And so we were designing software people would use to run ad campaigns and manage the stock exchange for advertising. And we had all these different settings. There were like 50 different parameters that you could set on your ad campaign. And then someone would hit run, and it would go spend real money from real advertising agencies, from real brands to buy ads that, as users, we see. And if you set the parameters wrong or you don't set them narrowly enough, it could also spend like $5,000 or $10,000 in 10 minutes or 3 minutes. So it was a very high-risk, really challenging interface because it was incredibly complicated. But the people who use it all day for work. But it was so complicated that the users would put on their CV that they knew the AppNexus platform, which meant that we had a lot of work to do. So we set out to redesign the ad campaign tool, and we had this like global setting, and we go and we do this like usability test of this thing we've prototyped and we've worked on for 2 months, we're super excited about. And we had a really big problem because for us, global meant this. This is like the 2.1 in the dictionary. Applying to the whole program or the whole system, but it had nothing to do with countries or geography. So some people thought that they'd be running the ad campaign. This version of the campaign tool never went to release. It was just in a prototype. But some people thought that they were about to run the ad campaign like to anyone in any country around the world. And they were like, I can't, I'm gonna stop. Like I wouldn't ever finish using this because I think if I check this box, I'm gonna show my English language ads for New York to people in Austria. And they would just like abandon ship and want to finish those tests right there. Because everyone in our like team where we had, going back to the IBM case, at that time, I was designer number 2, and maybe we had hired number 3, and there were 70 software engineers in our office. So that's who was prototyping with us, and we ended up with 2.1. When in reality, the non-native speakers or the other people had, they had number 1 as their definition. So this language also applies very quickly to usability testing and thinking about how people understand language and what it means. Another piece to which I'm sure some of you may disagree, but I actually think designers work really, really well when they're not subject matter experts. Okay? When we enter in any project, we ask the client to invest time and money in having us become subject matter experts, but the questions that we ask and the way that we approach projects are different because we don't know about it before, because we don't take anything for granted. So, for example, when he introduced me before, he mentioned, like, Julie's done projects, and he listed this crazy long list of, like, all the different things that I've done and worked on, but that's because I like learning about stuff, because I'm a huge nerd. So I basically, like, nerd out on something new in every project. And that's what empowers me to feel like I can become a better designer and do a good job, is because it's my job to learn all about something from my perspective. So what that means is if you work at an e-commerce website and you want to hire a UX designer, don't only hire people who've done e-commerce. Like, they can learn, like, the terms, the glossary, the software, the analytics, but if you limit yourself to only hire people who know about that industry and have worked in it, you're doing yourself a big disservice. Otherwise, like, you know, the studio where I work, we'd be out of business if we didn't do a good job because we're not subject matter experts. Otherwise, I wouldn't, right now, for example, at the beginning of this week, I was working on Industry 4.0 and business intelligence. A couple months ago, I was working on wearable devices. Before that, something related to shopping. And everything I've done in all those places contaminates me in how I do the new thing. And so that's part of, like, the interesting perspective that we bring, but this also means don't only look for people who've, like, done the certifications, the master in this, the master in that. Like, I have my bachelor's degree in government and political science, and I originally went to get a master's degree because people wouldn't hire me because I didn't have a design degree. Like, I checked all the boxes, I'd do really well in the interview, and they'd be like, well, but you didn't go to, like, design school A, B, or C in New York, so we're not gonna hire you. I had a bunch of interviews where that happened, and then I went to grad school. So look for people who have this mindset, who think in this way, and you'll see the results. The next is a comment about archetypes, not stereotypes. So I'm sure if I were to ask all of you, not in a room in this kind of social situation, what is my life like in Italy, or what was my life like in New York, you'd have a whole bunch of stereotypical ideas. If I were to tell you where I was born and raised, where I went to school, you probably have a bunch of preconceptions about who I am. But the reality is, when we tend to do research, especially if you're involving people who are in marketing, they'll be like, oh, we're looking for the soccer mom. Like, does anyone actually know a soccer mom? Like, I know one, she's a cousin. She doesn't fit any of the stereotypes. Like, she's a high-powered executive at a TV network in the United States. She's a single mom. And she lives in the middle of Manhattan. She doesn't drive a minivan. She checks none of the boxes. And she's a soccer mom. My little cousin plays soccer. And so we really need to move away from saying what the students do, what the moms do, what the young professional does, and we need to develop different kinds of archetypes of behavior. So when we go out and we do user research, and we're thinking about personas, or we're thinking about analyzing all of the input and insight that we collect, we should be trying to create different groupings based on behaviors and inputs and these archetypes. And so one example, which I actually don't have in here in the images, because the research output I would never share because it's comments people made to me in confidence in an interview. At one point, I worked on a mobile app for Comune di Bologna, the city of Bologna in Italy, that they had a big website with all the listings of cultural events in Bologna. Bologna in Italy has the highest concentration of cultural events for the number of people. It's a very small city with a very active university community and academic community, and just lots of stuff happening. The city has this, like, energetic vibe, kind of like London, Paris, New York, some, like, big global world capital, but it's a small Italian city. And they said, okay, can you, like, take this web directory we have of events and make an app of it, design that. And I insisted, like, well, no, but I want to understand how people would actually, like, use the app to find out about events and what their habits are. And so we went out and we did a bunch of research, and we talked to people in Milan, remotely in Bologna. We went to Bologna a little bit. And the people from Comune di Bologna kept talking about, well, we need to do things for the students so the students can find like the cheap events. And so the families can find these events and this event. And it turns out we found that there were like 4 or 5 different categories of event seekers, okay? One of them is the obsessive planner. So everyone has one of these friends that is the best person to go on vacation with because they plan everything and you just show up. That they book everything weeks ahead, they plan everything weeks ahead. Students are like this, moms are like, everyone has this group, this friend. I have this friend, she's amazing. And then there's another person who's the follower who just does whatever his or her friends, family are doing. And then we found that there are like the specialist fanatics. So I'm really into jazz music, and I'm gonna follow everything that happens with jazz music. And I don't remember what the 5th one was, but the point is, students had nothing to do with it. Like, budget was a factor, but whether or not they were a student had nothing to do with it, which was really confusing to the people in Comune di Bologna because their city understanding and city administration is what we deal with or do for the students and what we deal with or do for everyone else who's here. But actually, it turns out the way that we perceive events was quite different. Another project that's happened recently, and there's a really interesting article about this in my office, but I cannot take credit, is we've created these cards. So to take these different archetypes and then make cards that people can use in workshop activities. And this is the product of a couple of years of different kinds of research for Blue Lagoon, Iceland. So who here has been to Iceland? Oh wait, we're just 2, 3? Okay, did you go to Blue Lagoon? No, you're in like the 1%. Okay, just the airport, that's why. Okay, had you left the airport, you would have only left the airport for 3 hours, you probably would have gone there. So it's the most visited tourist destination in Iceland. It's a spa that now has 2 hotels, a 4-star hotel and a new super deluxe 5-star luxury hotel that starts at 1,000 euros a night. And for them, being the most biggest tourist destination in Iceland, with people coming from all over the world, but doing things like getting naked in locker rooms, getting into pools, showering, eating together in a calming space, but in large groups of travelers, they face a lot of these cross-cultural challenges. So our way of working through and understanding all the different kinds of travelers is the team went and created these cards that now the team for Blue Lagoon is actually using these physical cards that we printed to brainstorm and think about the customer journey as they basically redesign the whole experience from the ground up. For the next, and what we're working on now would probably be implemented in a few years. Some of it has already been implemented in the new luxury hotel. But this article is on Medium, it's also linked on our site. And the last, and this is one of those tried and true tools that comes from Bill Verplank. I assume many of you are familiar with this tool, the empathy map. If not, it's a really good way to start a project even within your team, with the client, on day 1 before you even go do research to figure out like what we even know about the users and what we could hypothesize as we figure out who we want to even go research with. So if we go back to, let's see if I can go back. My computer's being a little slow, sorry. If we go back to this, okay? The empathy map is translating everything that's here in the how do you do, how do you feel, how do you know, into an exercise. This is a template that I found online, so it's a template you can also find in print. And it's simply a worksheet that you have everyone fill out, and you imagine a user, or sometimes you can start with someone you've met before you have a chance to go do real research, and you think about what the person is hearing. So what are they hearing around them? What are they seeing around them in their context? What are they thinking, and what are they saying? And this is a really good starting point to help understand and insert yourself into someone's culture. So my last note that I'll give is, so Ettore Sozzas was a great Italian designer and thinker. There was a really beautiful exhibit, retrospective exhibit on his career around the time I first started working on this subject, in which there was one room very close to the end of the exhibit after you had seen all this like weird futuristic dystopia, utopian visions and things he had created, the furniture he had created. And then you went in this hallway and there were like all of the photos he had taken everywhere he had traveled in one room, in one hallway. And they had collected them and they wanted to show them because they thought his travels had informed his worldview. And this goes back to high context. So the Italian curators who curate the exhibit and the Italian designer want to show you the photos the designer collected in his career. And they had this quote from him on the wall that was really beautiful, in which he said, "I think that all cultures on the planet should intertwine more and more without abandoning the deep significance of their roots and origins. They should mix into metaphors and new, updated, comforting images applicable for the whole planet, because the region where we live is really only one. It's the planet." And this was him in the late 1980s, so he was like ahead of his time a lot, quite a lot. And you can read more about the exhibit online. It was really nice. And I have, I believe, just a few more minutes left, so I'll leave it for questions, reflections, comments.